Ah, you're here already. I wasn't expecting you so soon. Well, welcome. Welcome to the woods. Thank you for coming all this way to visit me, and to see the mountains of Yosemite. The cabin's a simple place, as you can see, but that's the way I like it. All the decoration is on the outside. Well, I'm eager to show you around, but you've just arrived. Relax for a while, settle in, and perhaps while you're resting you'd like to hear about some of my adventures. Well, my adventures began when I was just a young boy growing up in Scotland. When I was a boy, I loved everything that was wild. Wild birds and creatures, wild meadows and streams. My family lived in the little fishing town of Dunbar on the North Sea in Scotland. My mother was a kind and gentle woman, but my father was a man as serious as a snowstorm, and he'd say to me, "John, you come straight home from school, do you hear? It'll be the switch for you, like always." And you know the switch is just a wee taste of what's waiting for all bad boys down in the fires of hell. "Yes, father," I'd say. I tried to be good and come straight home, but it wasn't as easy as it sounded. I'd put my feet on the road towards home. Oh, but the hills and the trees, it was just like they were calling to me, "John, come and play, John." And before I knew it, I'd find my legs running out across the fields, as if with a mind of their own. I'd race up a high hill and climb to the top of the tallest tree, and there I'd wave back and forth in the wind, feeling the power of the air and feeling the strength of the trunk. I'd smell the salt tang of the sea air and gaze out over the land and across the waves, and like all children, I dreamed. I dreamed of all the places I'd go, all the adventures I'd have when I grew up. Little did I know the adventures that were waiting for me in the mountains of America, far across the sea. Oh, I'll tell you some of those when we get to that part of the story, but we're not there yet. I was busy having my own adventures as a boy right there in Scotland. Oh, how we boys loved adventure. My friends and I had a game we called Scoochers. Now, a scoocher is a feat of skill or courage. We dare each other to do such scoochers as climb a garden wall which had been studded in broken glass, put there by the gardeners to keep boys like us out, or to run long running races, or to swallow raw eggs whole. One of our favourite places to play was the old Dunbar Castle, a half-ruin of a castle which clung to the rocky shores, the stormy black headlands of the North Sea. "I bet, Willie McLaughlin, that you can no climb up to that hole in the wall there, beneath the overhanging arch. Do you see it?" "I see it sure enough, Johnny Muir. You know I do." "And we'll soon see whether I can climb or no. But if I climb up there, Johnny Muir, you've got to climb to the top of the castle wall and dance in the wind." I looked up to the top of the castle. It was a long way up, but I said, "I'll do it." Willie started up. It was hard, but Willie was a good climber. We boys watched as he picked his way slowly up the wall and then pulled himself into the hole and looked down at me. And the other boys were looking at me too. Now it was my turn. I had to climb stone by stone, finger-hold by finger-hold, up and up and up, while the wind whistled past my ears, and up, until at last I felt my fingers come up over the top edge, and I pulled myself up onto the top of the wall. I looked out over the rooftops of the town, and down at my friends below. They looked like ants down there. Then I remembered my promise to dance in the wind. "Hooray, hooray for Johnny Muir! No one's ever climbed to the top of the castle before." I got home from school well after dark that night, and my father's strut was waiting for me. No punishment could drive out the love of wild nature and adventure that seemed to flow through my veins like blood. There was a book in school about a faraway land called America. In those days, America was a brand new country. and it was still wild and open. In America, the book said, were all kinds of wild creatures, black bears and brown bears and mountain lions, herds of deer and buffalo, wolves that howled in the night, and birds. A bird called the passenger pigeon, which flew over in such huge flocks that the sky would be black for hours with their bodies as they streamed over. Look here, Willie. The book says that this tree, it's called a sugar maple, is so full of sugar water. All you have to do is drill a hole in the trunk of the tree, and the sugar water comes flowing out into your mouth. Is that right, Johnny? Well, I've heard that in America the ground is so full of gold, all you have to do is dig it up and you're rich. I didn't care much about the gold, but the thought of all that wildness filled me with excitement. I dreamed of going to America, but I never thought I'd really go. But sometimes, when you dream hard enough about something, it comes true. One night a miracle happened. We were over at our grandparents' house studying when our father, who never smiled or laughed, came bursting in all excited. "Bairns, put your books away." "Put our books away? But father, we're studying our lessons. We've got school on the morn." "You're not going to school, bairns. You're sailing. Sailing for America." "America? We're going to sugar in trees, growing in ground full of gold, wild birds and animals, fields and forests, and no homework, no school." My father might as well have said we were sailing for heaven on the morn. And sure enough, we sailed. We made our way to the sea coast and boarded a great sailing ship with masts tall like trees. And then, with the wind filling the sails, broad and wide like the wings of a great swan, we sailed out over the billowing waves of the sea. I stood at the bow of the boat, riding the waves, watching the seabirds sail and dive, and the dolphins leap and spin in the waves below. But I kept a sharp eye out for land ahead, the wind blowing through my hair. When we arrived in the new land, we put our belongings aboard another boat and sailed up the Hudson River and into the Erie Canal and out into the Great Lakes, which were as wide as oceans. You couldn't see across them. We landed at last in a place called Milwaukee, Wisconsin, where my father hired a big wooden wagon to put our things aboard. Pots and pans, bedding and clothes, books and tools, and a 500-pound cast-iron stove my father had bought to take with us into the wilderness. Then we Muirs perched ourselves atop the heap of stuff, and those poor horses pulled us and our things 100 miles over rutted, muddy wilderness roads to the little frontier town of Portage, Wisconsin. My father found a farm beside a lake and named our new home Fountain Lake Farm. But it didn't look like a farm at all. It was mainly trees. In those days, the forests of America were so thick that if you had been a squirrel, you could have travelled all the way from the Atlantic Ocean, where we landed on the ship, 1,000 miles to the Mississippi River, just by jumping and leaping from branch to branch and tree to tree, never putting your feet on the ground at all. But all that was changing fast. We weren't the only ones coming to the new land. Thousands of other families were coming to America from Scotland, and thousands more from Ireland, England, Italy, Germany, and Sweden. A flood of people were coming, and as they came, they cut the trees down, opening up the fields to plant in corn and wheat, building houses and towns and cities, and the land was changing. The forests were coming down. My father joined the tree-cutting frenzy. I can still see him out there with his big broad-bladed axe, swinging it against the huge oak and hickory trees, the sweat pouring off his face and his shirt soaking wet. This was work far too hard for boys of 10 and 12 years old, as my brother Davy and I were. We couldn't cut trees, so my father set us free. Free to roam through the woods, explore the shores of the lakes, and wander up the streams. It was a paradise. The woods where we lived were filled with the songs of 100 species of feathery singers, and as the fall came on, the lakes filled up with hundreds of brightly coloured ducks and geese. I loved to sneak quietly through the woods between the big trees, so the birds wouldn't see me, up to the very edge of the lake, and then I'd go, "Ah!" And the birds would explode up off the water in a great cloud of beating, flapping wings, and you could feel the wind on your face from their flying. The lake was beautiful. I wanted to get into that clear, warm water and swim, but I didn't know how to swim, so I decided to take lessons from the frogs. I sat and watched how they moved their legs and how they glided through the water, and then I got in and tried myself. Before long I was swimming. I practiced around the edges, and then one night I set off to swim across the lake under a sky full of stars. The stars were reflected in the water all around me, so it was stars above and stars below. It was like swimming through space. And in the fields around the lake I saw more dancing lights, the twinkling and pulsing of lightning bugs. The woods were filled with blueberries and huckleberries and blackberries, and my favourite, wild strawberries, sweet as honey. And there were hickory nuts and hazelnuts and wild apples. Sometimes I came home from the woods so full I couldn't eat my supper. Windy storms would blow in and set the trees to dancing and singing, transforming the whole forest into a symphony and ballet of forest music. Sometimes lightning would strike, setting the whole tree afire, blazing up to the heavens, the sparks mixing with the stars. Nature streamed into us, teaching us her wonderful glowing lessons. Every wild lesson, a love lesson, not thrashed, but charmed into us. Oh, that glorious Wisconsin wilderness. Very soon, though, the hard work of running a farm began. I was up at dawn or before each morning to do my chores. I cut wood for the fire, for we had no thermostat or furnace to heat the house. No, you had to cut wood and build a fire in the iron wood stove. And I carried buckets down to the well below to fetch water, for there were no pipes and faucets in the house. No one had such things. I sharpened the iron tools we would use in the fields that day, and shovelled out the horse manure and cow manure from the barn. These were my chores before breakfast. After breakfast, it was 10 or 12 hours of work in the fields. Ploughing always fell to me, as I could plough the straightest rows. I'd hitch up the plough, a big knife that cut and turned the earth, to our big ox, Buck, and Buck and I would make our way up and down the fields, cutting the rows. One day, as Buck and I were ploughing the fields for winter wheat, I heard a sound on the distant horizon. It was like faraway thunder or the roaring of a river. I looked and there wasn't a cloud in the sky. The sound grew louder, and then I saw a black and shimmering cloud on the horizon, which began to grow and grow, filling up the sky as the roaring grew louder and louder. As the cloud came closer, I at last could see what it was. Birds! Passenger pigeons they were! A great rolling, surging, tumbling river of beating wings. I threw my arms up in the air and shouted, "Beautiful, bonny birds!" And just then their droppings fell on me like hail. But I didn't care. If I'd had wings, I would have leapt up in the sky to fly away free with those birds. Fly far away from that farm, far from all that hard work. But I had no wings, just feet, and I was stuck to the ground, to that farm and that work for years to come yet. We worked every day but Sunday, and Sunday was church. In the afternoon, after church, I had my only free time, and I'd walk for miles to borrow books from neighbours. Now, books in those days were rare and valuable. With a book, I could have great adventures and travel to faraway places, while just sitting underneath an oak tree. The trouble was, I had very little time to read. My father was very strict. We were all up at dawn, and it was straight to work. In the evening, supper, family prayers, and right to bed. One night, though, when the rest of the family had gone to bed, I stayed up by the lamp reading. But not 2 minutes had gone by when my father called out, John, put the lamp out and go to bed.
Yes, father. And I put the lamp out and climbed the stairs to bed. But the next night I again stayed up by the lamp reading. Even 2 minutes was a treasure.
John, must I give you a separate instruction every night to put the lamp out and go to bed?
No, father.
John, you must go. When the rest going without me telling you. Is that clear, John?
Yes, father. As I climbed the stairs to bed, I heard my father's voice call after me.
John, if you must read, get up in the morning and read. You may get up as early as you like.
As early as I like?
I vowed to myself that the moment I woke up, I would spring from bed to take full advantage.
I fell right off to sleep. When I woke up, it was still dark out. I could hear my brothers breathing in the beds beside. I could feel a crust of ice around my mouth where my breath had frozen to the woolen blanket. But I remembered my promise. I pulled my legs from under the warm blankets, put my feet on the cold oak boards, and scrambled my clothes on. Then I stumbled down the stairs to the kitchen, lit the lamp, and gazed at the clock. 1 o'clock in the morn. 5 hours. 5 huge solid hours all to myself. For days I got up early and read to my heart's content, immersing myself in the wonderful books. Then, one day, I decided to set to work on an invention I'd been dreaming up in my mind. I wanted to build a clock that would tell not only the time of day, but the day of the week and the month of the year. I'd never made a clock before, but I could see it all in my mind, all the parts, clear as if they were before me. How they fit together and how they moved. I knew it would work. All I had to do was build it. So I set to work carving all the parts out of wood from branches from the trees around the farm. Day followed day, and week followed week, and slowly the parts came together and the clock took shape. And one bright spring morning, it was finished. I carried the clock up the stairs and put it behind some old rusty tools in a storeroom that was rarely used. But my luck was bad. The very next day my little sister came up to me with her eyes wide. "John, Father has discovered your clock." I went running up the stairs, and there was Father kneeling down, looking at the clock, watching the pendulum swing back and forth. When he heard me come in, he stood and turned and left the room without saying a word. I was ecstatic. Father hadn't prohibited me from continuing to invent, so my next invention was in the true American spirit. It was a bigger, better clock. This clock had a face 8 feet wide and pendulums 14 feet long. Then I made a sawmill that used the power of the stream to cut the wood. One day, a neighbouring farmer came to visit, and as he looked at all of my inventions, his eyes got bigger and bigger, until at last he looked up at me and said, "Son, these are mighty inventive things to be coming out of the backwoods of Wisconsin. You should take 'em to the state fair and show 'em off to the townsfolks there." "Why, sir," I said, "do you think townsfolks would be interested in simple things like these made out of wood?" "Wood! Who cares what they're made out of? They're so out and out original. You take 'em to the fair and see if the folks there aren't just as interested as I am." So that summer I put all of my contraptions aboard the train. Oh, I felt like I was flying, rolling down the tracks at 40 miles an hour, all the way to the big city of Madison, Wisconsin. At the state fair, I stood before a big crowd of people who had gathered around my machines. I decided to demonstrate one of my favourite inventions, what I called an early rising machine. It was sort of a combination of a bed and an alarm clock, but it worked much better than an alarm clock for getting you up in the morning. I chose a boy out of the audience and asked him to lie down on the bed of my early rising machine, and then I put a blanket over him. Then I addressed the audience. "Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, today you're going to see something new in the history of waking up. This young lad is not only going to wake up, he's going to get up, on time and with no complaining." I set the clock to work, and everyone waited. The clock was running, and when the moment arrived, at first nothing happened. But then it began to creak and groan, and then it began to shake and tremble, and then the bed upon which the boy lay began to tilt, first slowly, and then faster, until the boy was thrown out of bed onto his feet, awake, up, and ready for the day. Well, I won first prize at the state fair for my machines, and the news of the young backwoods genius, John Muir, got home in the newspapers before I arrived home on the train. I was so excited. I could be an inventor. I could help people. Maybe I could really make a difference in the world. The next year I came back to Madison, this time to attend the university. I studied all kinds of things, botany and geology and chemistry, and I kept on inventing. After a few years I left school and wandered, studying plants and trees and flowers. I took jobs in factories as I went. Everywhere I worked, my ideas improved the productivity of the factory so much, the owners offered me partnerships in their businesses. But one night an event occurred that was to set the course for the rest of my life. I was working late in a factory, using the sharp end of a file to unlace a belt that had grown loose on one of the machines. The file got stuck. I tugged and pulled at it, trying to free it. Suddenly the file sprung loose, flew up, and the sharp end pierced through my right eye. I threw the file to the ground and held my hands to my face. I could feel the clear liquid, the aqueous humour, draining out of my eyeball into the palm of my hand. Within moments the sight in my other eye had gone black too, from the sympathetic nervous shock. I stumbled blindly out of the factory, and passers-by helped me home and into bed. My friends, they pooled their money and hired a fine doctor, a specialist from Europe. The doctor operated on the eye, but could give me little hope. "Mr. Muir, I've done the best I can, but I cannot guarantee you'll ever see out of that eye again. And as for the other eye, well, we'll just have to wait and see when it comes back." I lay in bed completely depressed. Children came to sing me songs and bring me flowers, but nothing could make me feel better. I scribbled in my journal, "The wind and the sun are playing in all the gardens of God, but John Muir, he is lost." I waited, hoping, day after day, with bandages across my face, and finally, at the end of the month, the doctor came. As he removed the bandages, I could see light through both eyelids. I opened my eyes, and I could see. I could see out of both eyes. As my eyes adjusted to the light, I approached the window and looked out at the sun streaming through the trees and the wind playing in the branches. I decided right then and there that I would dedicate my life not to machines, but to nature, to wild and growing things, to the beauty of mountains and trees, wild animals and birds. To celebrate, I set off walking on a 1,000-mile walk from Indiana to the Gulf of Mexico, taking the wildest, leafiest, least trodden way that I could find, zigzagging like a butterfly. I wrote in my journal my new address: John Muir, Earth Planet, Universe. When I got to Florida, I boarded a steamer boat to Panama, walked across the Panama Isthmus, for there was no Panama Canal in those days, and sailed on a sailing ship north up the Pacific coast to San Francisco. I took a ferry boat across San Francisco Bay, climbed up into the green, rolling coastal hills, and then went running out across the Great Central Valley of California, wading through grass stems and flower stems over my head, surrounded by a sea of flowers like a great golden flower bed, a lake of pure sunshine. At last, I climbed up into the Sierra Mountains and made my way into another valley, even more beautiful, Yosemite. If you haven't been to Yosemite, imagine a huge room. The floor of this room is about a mile across and 7 miles long. It's covered with grasses and trees and laced with streams and a river. Now, imagine the walls of the room on two sides. They're not 10 or 20 feet high, but 3,000 and 4,000 feet high, The beautiful clean granite walls, almost a mile high, stretch straight up into the sky. And over the top of those huge walls come falling waterfalls, tumbling and roaring and streaming and singing their mountain songs. One summer morning I was up walking along the high rim of the valley, along the edges of the cliffs, looking 3,000 feet down into the Great Yosemite. The trouble is the cliffs are rounded off at the edges, so I had trouble finding a place with a sharp edge where I could walk out and look straight down the face of the cliff to the bottom. After searching for a while, I found such a place and approached it very carefully. Oh, what a view! But I couldn't help being afraid that the rock might not break off and let me fall. And oh, what a fall! Backing up from this place, I said to myself, "Now, John, don't go back out to the edge again." But I couldn't help it. The view was too beautiful. After a while, I came upon Yosemite Creek, the stream that becomes Yosemite Falls when it tumbles over the cliff, the greatest falls of the valley, and the highest falls in America. The stream was beautiful and clear, singing its mountain songs. Right before the cliff, the stream rests for a while in a clear pool, as if getting ready, preparing itself. Then it accelerates down the last steep slope and takes the great plunge over the edge of the tremendous cliff, springing free out into the air. I took off my shoes and stockings and made my way barefoot down the steep rock alongside the rushing water towards the falls. The booming, crashing of the water rushing close past my ears was very exciting. I'd hoped that when I reached the bottom of the slope, I would be able to lean out far enough to see the waterfall all the way down. But no, when I arrived I discovered that there was still a small rocky brow, over which I could not see, and which appeared to be too steep for human feet. There, right on the edge, I saw a thin ledge, about 3 inches wide, on which I might rest my heels. And there seemed to be no way of getting down to it. I searched the rock beside me and found a sharp edge which might give me the slightest of finger holds. Oh, but the slope was dangerously steep and smooth, and the swift roaring flood of water below, beside, and overhead, booming and crashing in my ears, was nerve-trying indeed. I decided not to go any further, but did anyway. With extraordinary caution, I crept down and got myself safely onto that narrow ledge. Then, with my back to the wall, I shuffled to the side 10 or 15 feet, until I was nearly underneath the outpouring torrent of the waterfall. From here, with the waterfall booming all around me, I could get a clear view down into the very heart of the slowly chanting throng of silvery streamers. I got back to camp about dark, excited, exhilarated, triumphant, determined to have as many mountain adventures as I could find. One of my most exciting Yosemite adventures took place on a fine winter morning after a big snowstorm. I was eager to see avalanches, snow rivers that slide down the mountains after big storms. I wanted to see as many avalanches as possible and wide views of the forest and summit peaks in their new white robes before the sunshine had time to melt and settle the snow into place. So I set out early to climb up through a narrow side canyon of the valley. I was hoping to reach a commanding ridge high above the valley floor. But on account of the looseness of the snow that blocked the canyon, I knew the climb would take a long time, some 3 or 4 hours I guessed. But the climbing proved far more difficult than I had expected. Most of the way I sank waist deep in the snow, almost out of sight in some places. By late afternoon I was still far from the top, and I gave up seeing anything but the sunset. Well, I was not to have any view that day, it seems. For near the head of the canyon, almost to the top, my deep tramping in the snow set off an avalanche, and suddenly I found myself swished down the canyon as if by enchantment. When the avalanche started, I threw myself on my back and spread my arms wide to keep from sinking. The canyon was steep, and the ride fast, but gratefully there were no cliffs high enough to cause me to outbound or free fly. And the ride was smooth. I was not buried, but rode on the surface or just below it, while a mist of back-streaming snow particles flew over me. And as the snow beneath me and around me was flying as well, there was no friction, though I was tossed here and there and lurched about from side to side. When the avalanche came to rest at last, I found myself sitting safely atop it, like a strawberry on an ice cream. Not a scratch or a bruise. My wallowing struggle up the mountain had taken me 8 hours, and my quick flight down, less than a minute. Few visitors to Yosemite ever have the pleasure of seeing an avalanche, and fewer still know the exhilaration of riding one. In all my mountaineering, I've enjoyed only this one avalanche ride, and the start was so sudden, and the end came so soon, I had but little time to think what was happening, though at such times one thinks fast. I was out walking one day with a dog friend of mine named Carlo. Now, Carlo was a St. Bernard, a sheepdog. We were ambling peacefully through the Yosemite meadows when suddenly Carlo stopped dead still. His ears came up, and his tail went down. He pushed his nose forward, and he sniffed the air. Then his eyes grew wide, and he looked up at me as if to say, "John, it's a bear." Well, I'd never seen a California bear before, and I was just as excited as Carlo was. So Carlo and I went stalking through the forest together, hiding behind the big ponderosa pine trees, looking for the bear. After a while we came to a small clearing, and sure enough, there on the far side of the meadow, we saw him. He was a big fellow, about 8 feet tall, and looked to weigh about 500 pounds. He was standing on his hind legs in grass up to his waist, and he was alert, sniffing the air. He hadn't seen us yet, but he knew something was up. We hid behind a big pine tree and watched him. He was handsome, intelligent, and noble-looking, like the very king of the forest. But after a good long while admiring him, I began to wonder if it wouldn't be a fine thing to see what a bear looked like running. He would look wonderfully graceful and strong, I thought, bounding through the meadow. I remembered the words of a friend of mine. Black bears will always run away from people if they're not protecting their cubs. Well, I could see no cubs, so suddenly I sprung out from behind the tree and went running at the bear, waving my arms and shouting like a crazy man. "Ah!" But the bear didn't run. I made another dash towards him and shouted again. "Ah!" The bear still didn't run, but thrust his head forward and bared his teeth, holding his ground. I was afraid now that if I didn't think fast, I would be the one doing the running. The power of the human gaze is very strong, so I stared at the bear intensely, but he met my gaze directly and showed no trace of fear. We stood there like that for many long minutes, looking at each other in the eyes, until the sweat was dripping off me. Then suddenly the bear turned and lumbered off into the forest, and I sat down and breathed a huge sigh of relief. I began to realize that bear had had much better forest manners than I, and I had something to learn from him. The bear had just politely excused himself when he didn't like the company, while I had behaved very badly indeed. I began to see that there was something to learn from almost everything in nature, if I just kept my eyes open. The birds, for instance, taught me about freedom and happiness. They sung all the time, winging freely in the air. I wanted to be like that. And the trees taught me about peace. They stood calm and strong even in storms and bad weather in the worst of times, bending gracefully in the harshest of winds. I wanted to be like that too. Not long afterwards, I came upon a dead bear on the forest floor. I sat beside him and wrote in my journal, "Bears are made of the same dust as we. They breathe the same winds and drink of the same waters. Their days are warmed by the same sun, and they live under the same blue sky. and their lives turn and ebb with the same heart pulsings as our own, and were poured from the same first fountain. I went out into the mountains during all seasons of the year. In the spring and summer and fall, I wouldn't even bring blankets with me, and often left my coat behind as well, wanting to have my arms free for mountain climbing. I used pine needles and fir branches for blankets, and if I got really cold, I built a fire and lay down beside it, turning over and over all night long to keep from getting too cold on one side and too hot on the other. In the morning, I'd eat some bread and set off to climb another mountain. Sometimes, sitting in some high place, watching the sun come up and the world come alive, bathed in that rare Sierra light, I began to feel like I was melting into nature, as if the sun shone not on me, but in me, as if the waters flowed not past, but through me, as if every speck of nature was a part of my very own body. I began to see that everything in the world is important. Bears and beetles and butterflies, swallows and fast-flying swifts, and great sequoias. Everything is part of the great life of nature, everything working together, everything helping and depending on everything else. If you try to pick out any one animal or plant, you find that it's hitched to everything else in the universe. Oh, but not everyone appreciates the great harmony of nature. There were thousands of people coming to California, and the more people that came, the more destruction they brought with them. The forests were cut down and mountains dug into. The streams were dredged up and the rivers dammed, and huge flocks of sheep, woolly, cloven-hoofed locusts, were set loose to trample the high mountain meadows and devour every last wildflower and blade of grass in sight. Everywhere people went, they seemed to take, and not think ever of giving anything back to nature. And the tree cutters, they were not content to cut down the ordinary trees. They insisted on cutting down the king trees as well, the ancient sequoias. The oldest of the sequoias are 30 feet wide at the base, as wide as a house, and the huge trunks lift up 300 feet into the sky. These ancient trees are over 3,000 years old. Do you know what that means? That means that these huge trees that are still alive today were babies sprouting up from seeds when the pharaohs were building the pyramids. They were already 1,000 years old when the Romans were racing their chariots in the Colosseum. And by the time Columbus had discovered America, the trees were already 2,500 years old. And they're still alive today, waving and singing in the mighty forests of the Sierras. But now the fools were cutting them down. Not just single trees, but whole groves of them. And when it was too slow to cut the trees down, they began dynamiting them. So much of the wood was blown to smithereens that less than 1/3 of the tree was usable, and the rest lay splintered and useless on the forest floor. And why did they want the wood in the first place? Lumber, you say, to build houses. But no, sequoia wood makes poor lumber. The boards split and bend. You can't build a house of it. But the wood lasts forever. It never rots. So they wanted the trees to make fence posts. Fence posts! Cut a sequoia down to make fence posts? Why not cut down the Statue of Liberty so you can make tin cans? Well, I knew nature could be used and cooperated with. We need paper and lumber, but this dynamiting of ancient trees was murder. I began to write letters to the newspapers and articles to the magazines, letting Americans know what was happening in the forests. Any fool can destroy trees, I wrote. They cannot defend themselves or run away, and few destroyers of trees ever plant any. Not that planting could do much to bring back our huge aboriginal giants. Through all the centuries, these trees have been protected from drought, disease, avalanche, fire, and flood. But who will protect them from fools and sawmills? Only the American people can do that. Well, the American people read my words and listened, and they began to write letters too. A flood of letters washed into the offices of the governor and the congressman, even the president. And the people demanded that laws be passed to protect the trees. Well, the politicians got off their backsides for once, and laws were passed, and the trees were saved. And there they stand today. You can go and see them, waving and singing in the mighty forests of the Sierra. They'll be there a long time. You can take your children and your grandchildren when you have them. Those trees will outlive all of us. One of the men who read my words was Teddy Roosevelt. The president was a very enthusiastic man, and he was excited about my ideas of protecting wild land. So Mr. Roosevelt came to visit me in Yosemite. When the president got off the train, I recognized him right away. He wasn't tall, but he was full of energy and enthusiasm. A crowd of politicians was waiting with speeches and bands, but the president said, "Where is John Muir?" And I stepped forward. "Let's go," said the president. And we left all the politicians behind and rode on horseback out into the Sierra Mountains. The president and I camped for 3 days and 2 nights, and as we rode along, he asked me, "Mr. Muir, what do you think we can do to protect America's wild land?" For the president knew better than anyone else that America's wild land was being lost. The forests were being cut down faster than anyone could imagine. The mountains were being dug up. Streams and rivers were dredged and dammed. And so the president said, "Mr. Muir, what can we do to protect America's wild land?" "Mr. President," I said, "the wild land of America, which we once thought was endless, is rapidly being invaded, and everything destructible in it is being destroyed. Mr. President, we need a new kind of park. Not small parks, big parks. National parks that will hold wide forests and mountains and canyons and keep them safe. National parks, many of them, all across the country, from ocean to ocean. Parks that will protect the most beautiful of America's wild land. Parks where generations of Americans, boys and fathers and grandfathers, girls and their mothers and grandmothers, can see the glory of this land as it always has been, and as it always will be if we have the courage to protect it." The president liked my ideas, and on the last night we slept out beneath the overhanging branches of a great sequoia tree. It snowed that night, and when the president woke up, he found that 4 inches of new snow had fallen on his blankets. The president leapt up from his blanket and looked about at the mountains and trees and their new cover of snow. And then he shouted, "Bully! Bully! Muir, these were the best days I've had for a long time." And you know, the president rushed back to Washington, all fired up with our idea, and he set to work. In a very short time, we had not only Yosemite, but 5 new national parks, and nearly 200 million acres of wild forest land. That's the kind of effect that a night in the mountains can have on a person. Go to the mountains, or out into nature anywhere, and see for yourself. Nature will stream into you like sunshine flows into trees. The winds will blow their own freshness into you, and the storms their energies, and your cares and worries will fly away like autumn leaves. Sit down beside a stream and let it sing to you, or lean against a big tree and feel its peace and strength. Look up at the stars and see the grandness of the world and the universe. Go to nature and let it teach you and comfort you and be your friend. Then come back and tell everyone that we must take care of the land, take care of wild creatures and the places wild creatures live. If we do that, we'll be taking care of ourselves. For when nature is healthy, we are healthy. We'll have only one home, and we must care for it well. Well now, that's some of my story. There is much more, but to hear it you'll have to pay me another visit sometime. I never knew I would do so much. Really, I only went out for a walk. But I decided to stay out till sundown, for going out to nature, I found, was really going home.